The Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, 1962. 1,200 people in the Copa Room, senators, movie stars, oil tycoons, and in the front row, 3 men who could have you killed with a phone call. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the kind of tension that only exists when very dangerous people are trying to have a good time. Dean Martin was on stage, halfway through That's Amore, making the crowd laugh with his usual drunk act, when the doors at the back of the showroom swung open. Every head turned. Johnny Rosselli walked in. If you don't know that name, you didn't grow up in the right neighborhoods. Rosselli was the Chicago outfits man in Hollywood. He was the fixer, the enforcer, the man who made problems disappear into the Nevada desert. He had helped build Las Vegas from nothing, and he collected on that debt every single day. Rosselli wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 men who looked like they bench-pressed Cadillacs for fun. They walked through the showroom like they owned it, because in a very real sense, they did. The music didn't stop. Dean kept singing, but something shifted in the room. The laughter got nervous. The applause got careful. Everyone understood that something was happening, even if they didn't know what. Rosselli walked straight to the front of the stage. He didn't sit down at a table. He didn't wait for the maitre d'. He stood there, directly below Dean Martin, arms crossed, staring up at the man with the microphone. Dean finished the song. The applause was scattered, uncertain. The band vamped, waiting for direction. The room held its breath. Rosselli spoke, not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. His voice carried the weight of 100 shallow graves. He said Dean had been disrespectful. He said Dean had forgotten who his friends were. He said Dean needed to apologize. Right now. On stage. In front of everyone. 1,200 people watched. Senators and movie stars and oil tycoons watched. The 3 men in the front row, who could have you killed, watched. Dean Martin looked down at Johnny Rosselli, the most dangerous man in Las Vegas. And then he did something that should have gotten him killed. He laughed. What happened over the next 5 minutes became legend. It became a story that wise guys would tell each other for decades, always in whispers, always with a shake of the head. It became proof that Dean Martin wasn't just the king of cool, he was untouchable. To understand why Rosselli was standing at the foot of that stage, ready to destroy Dean Martin's career, or possibly his life, you have to understand how Las Vegas worked in 1962. Las Vegas wasn't a city, it was a machine. And the machine was owned by the mob, the casinos, the hotels, the showrooms, the restaurants, even the taxi cabs and the wedding chapels. Everything flowed through channels that led back to Chicago, New York, and Kansas City. The legitimate businessmen whose names appeared on the licenses were just fronts. The real owners sat in back, rooms counting money that would never appear on any tax return. The entertainment industry was no different. If you wanted to perform in Las Vegas, you needed permission. If you wanted your records played on certain radio stations, you needed permission. If you wanted your face on a billboard on the Strip, you needed permission. Permission came from men like Johnny Rosselli. Rosselli had been in the game since the 1920s. He had worked with Al Capone. He had survived the wars that tore apart the Italian underworld in the 30s and 40s. He had emerged as one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the smartest. He understood that the future of the mob wasn't in bootlegging or numbers rackets. It was in legitimate businesses that could be controlled from the shadows. It was in Las Vegas. Rosselli had helped build the Strip. He had been there when Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo. He had watched the desert transform into a neon paradise. He had his fingers in every pie, his ears in every room, his eyes on every dollar, and he had a problem with Dean Martin. The problem had started 6 months earlier. Dean had been approached by one of Rosselli's associates about a business opportunity, a nightclub in Palm Springs that needed a famous investor. The terms were generous. The returns were guaranteed. All Dean had to do was put his name on some papers and show up for the grand opening. Dean had said no. It wasn't the first time he had said no. Dean had been saying no to the mob for years. He was polite about it. He was friendly about it. But the answer was always the same. He didn't want partners. He didn't want investors. He didn't want to owe anyone anything. This drove the mob crazy. They were used to entertainers who were desperate for their approval. Frank Sinatra would fly across the country just to have dinner with a capo. Sammy Davis Jr. would perform at private parties for free just to stay in their good graces. The whole system was built on the assumption that famous people wanted power and would trade their independence to get it. But Dean didn't want power. Dean wanted to play golf and sing songs and go home at a reasonable hour. He didn't need their money because he made plenty of his own. He didn't need their protection because he had never made any enemies. He didn't need their validation because he genuinely didn't care what anyone thought of him. This made him dangerous. Not because he was a threat, but because he was an example. If Dean Martin could succeed without playing ball, others might try to follow. After Dean rejected the Palm Springs deal, Roselli decided to send a message. He started with small things. A booking that fell through at the last minute. A radio station that suddenly stopped playing Dean's records. A gossip columnist who wrote something unflattering. Dean ignored all of it. This made Roselli furious. The whole point of sending a message was to get a response. Fear, submission, an apologetic phone call, something. But Dean just kept showing up, kept performing, kept charming audiences, as if nothing was happening. He didn't complain, he didn't negotiate, he didn't even seem to notice. So, Roselli decided to handle it personally. He flew to Las Vegas specifically to confront Dean Martin. He chose the Copa Room at the Sands because it was Dean's home turf. He chose a sold-out Saturday night because he wanted maximum witnesses. He wanted the whole world to see what happened when you disrespected the outfit. He had no idea what he was walking into. Dean looked down at Roselli from the stage. The band had stopped playing. The room was silent. 1,200 people waited to see what would happen. Roselli's demand hung in the air like poison gas. Apologize. On stage, in front of everyone. The smart play was obvious. Apologize. Make a joke out of it. Smooth things over. Live to fight another day. That's what any sane person would do when confronted by a man who had people buried in the desert. Dean took a drag of his cigarette. He let the silence stretch. Then he turned to the audience, that lazy smile spreading across his face, and said something that made Roselli's blood freeze. He said he was sorry. He said he was sorry that some people in the audience were confused about how showrooms worked. He said he was sorry that some people thought they could just walk in, interrupt a show, and start making speeches. He said he was sorry that some people's mothers hadn't taught them any manners. The audience gasped. Roselli's face went dark. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The two men flanking him shifted their weight, ready for whatever came next. But Dean wasn't finished. He turned to the band leader and asked for a song, a specific song. Ain't that a kick in the head? The band started playing. Dean began to sing, but he changed the lyrics. He improvised new words on the spot. Words that seemed to be about a man who walked into a room thinking he was important, only to discover that nobody cared. Words about a man who confused money for respect. Words about a man who was about to learn the difference between being feared and being admired. The audience started to laugh. At first, it was nervous laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from tension, not joy. But as Dean kept going, as the improvised verses got sharper and funnier, the laughter became real. Dean was roasting Johnny Roselli. He was roasting one of the most dangerous men in America in public to his face, with 1,200 witnesses who were suddenly laughing along. Each new verse was a precision strike. Dean never mentioned Roselli by name. He never said anything that could be repeated in court, but everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. Every joke was a knife. Every punchline was a slap. The masterpiece was that Dean never seemed angry. He never seemed scared. He performed the whole thing with the same lazy charm he always had. As if this was just another bit, just another song, just another Saturday night at the Sands. Roselli stood frozen at the foot of the stage. He couldn't leave. If he walked out now, he would look like a coward. He would look like a man who had been humiliated and couldn't take it. He couldn't charge the stage. Even mobsters had to maintain appearances. Attacking an entertainer in front of 1,000 civilians would bring heat that nobody wanted. He couldn't even respond. Dean had the microphone. Dean had the band. Dean had the audience. Any interruption would just give Dean more material. All Roselli could do was stand there and take it. The song went on for almost 4 minutes. 4 minutes of surgical humiliation. 4 minutes of Dean Martin demonstrating in real time why he was the king of cool and Johnny Roselli was just another tough guy with a bad temper. When the song finally ended, the Copa room exploded with applause. Standing ovation. Dean took a bow. He looked down at Roselli and gave him a wink. Just a small one. A private acknowledgement between two men who both understood what had just happened. Then Dean nodded to the band, and they launched into the next song, as if nothing had occurred. Roselli turned around and walked out. He didn't run, he didn't hurry, but he left. He walked through those 1,200 people who had just watched him get destroyed, and he disappeared into the Las Vegas night. The show went on for another hour. Dean was brilliant, relaxed, effortless. He had just publicly humiliated a made man, and he acted like it was no more stressful than ordering breakfast. The aftermath of that night became one of the most closely guarded secrets in mob history. Roselli flew back to Chicago the next morning. He met with Sam Giancana, the boss of the outfit, and demanded permission to retaliate. He wanted Dean Martin hurt. He wanted Dean Martin scared. He wanted Dean Martin to understand that nobody, no matter how famous, could embarrass the organization like that. Giancana listened. He asked questions. He thought about it. Then he said no. The reasoning was purely practical. Dean Martin was too famous. He was too connected. He was a friend of the Kennedys, a friend of politicians, a friend of people who could cause real problems. Killing him, or even hurting him, would bring a level of attention that the outfit couldn't afford. But there was something else too, something that Giancana understood that Roselli didn't. Dean had won because he genuinely didn't care. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't pretending. He had looked into the abyss and shrugged. You can't intimidate a man who isn't afraid of losing anything. You can't threaten a man who would genuinely be happy dealing blackjack in Ohio if his career ended tomorrow. Giancana recognized this. He had seen it before in the old country, in men who had survived things that should have broken them. There was no leverage on Dean Martin, no pressure point, no weakness to exploit. Leave him alone, Giancana told Roselli. He's not worth the headache. Roselli never approached Dean Martin again. In fact, something strange happened in the years that followed. The minor harassment stopped. The bookings that had been falling through started coming back. The radio stations that had gone quiet started playing his records again. The mob had decided that Dean Martin was off limits. Not because they feared him, not because they respected him in the traditional sense, but because they recognized that he was playing a different game. He had opted out of the system entirely, and there was no way to punish someone who had nothing you could take. Word spread through the underworld. Dean Martin is untouchable. Don't waste your time. The stories about the Copa Room incident multiplied and evolved. In some versions, Dean had threatened Roselli right back. In some versions, he had made Roselli cry. In some versions, the whole thing had been arranged in advance as some kind of test. But the people who were actually there that night knew the truth. They had watched a man with a microphone defeat a man with a gun. They had watched charm conquer fear. They had watched someone demonstrate, in real time, that true power isn't about violence or money or intimidation. True power is about not needing anything from anyone. Dean Martin never talked about that night publicly. If anyone asked about his relationship with the mob, he would smile and change the subject. He never bragged, he never claimed victory. He just kept singing, kept joking, kept making the world feel like everything was going to be okay. But the people who knew him saw the truth underneath the surface. Dean had learned something growing up in Steubenville, Ohio, working in illegal gambling dens and boxing and underground fights. He had learned that the most dangerous men in the world aren't the ones who threaten you. They're the ones who don't need to. He had spent his whole life cultivating a persona that couldn't be threatened. The drunk act, the laziness, the apparent indifference to success, it was all armor. Not against the public, against the predators who circled the entertainment industry looking for weakness. Frank Sinatra spent his whole life chasing the mob's approval, trying to be accepted as one of them, and they used him like a tool. They borrowed his planes, they used his connections, they called in favors whenever they wanted. Dean Martin kept them at arm's length, never asked for anything, never owed anything, and they treated him like a king. The lesson is simple, but almost nobody learns it. The most powerful word in the English language isn't yes. It isn't please. It isn't even no. It's the silence of a man who doesn't need your permission. Dean Martin walked into a room full of killers and walked out a legend. Not because he was brave, not because he was tough, but because he understood something that most people never figure out. You can't scare someone who's already free. That night at the Sands, Johnny Roselli thought he was going to make an example out of Dean Martin. Instead, Dean Martin made an example out of him. The last laugh belongs to the man who doesn't need to win. And Dean Martin was always laughing.